Hi, let's continue working on the shader for our snail body. This is where we left on the last video. Here's the graph. I'm just gonna organize it a tiny bit. So we added a little bit of specular. We can maybe bring this a tiny bit up, just very slightly. Any little change you do to this graph will have a subtle effect, but at the end, complex shaders are all about subtle effects. So we have this, we added some bump here, and now we're gonna add like an extra, more like a dirt layer or something that has no specular, like maybe a lot of roughness and looks like the body's being, it's grabbing a lot of dirt on its way. So I'm gonna create another V-Ray material. I'm gonna call this body code 01, and I'm gonna bring another file. I have a texture for it. In body code. There we go. This is the code. And we're also going to bring, I've made a mask for it. So I'm going to duplicate this guy connected to my place texture. Let's bring the coat mask. There we go. So I'm going to attach this to my diffuse color, plug this into my blend material, and now use this as my blend amount. That's for the coat material 1, so I'm going to use it for the blend amount 1. Just take a quick render and see how that looks. So it's a very subtle effect, but we're adding some little bits of um, dirt and grunge in some parts. Maybe we can take a render at a different part just to see how that looks. Okay, let's continue working. I might want to edit this a tiny bit just to like give it some contrast, just so we can get like a more defined area. And one of the things I'm going to do is I've been doing with most of them, I like to use my masks as a bump map. That way I can really differentiate between one layer and the other, since we're not using this as a thin or film layer. So I'm going to plug this as my bump, change my bump values. Here they are, maybe something like 0.15, and I'm going to adjust the roughness a little bit so it looks really dirty or grudgy, maybe 0.25. There we go. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so it's very subtle effect, but we're adding and adding and adding, and all this combination of different layers are what really, if you see this looks more complex and more elaborate than this part, which was really nice, but it still wasn't enough. One of the things I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a remap and maybe just control a tiny bit the influence of this here. So I'm going to connect this, my R color, to my input value. This is just a black and white mask. And I'm going to connect my out value. Actually, let me break this to make sure it works well. So I'm going to connect my out value to my blend amount RGB. And then we can start. I mean, we could just reverse this to see what happens. So we get dust everywhere. We don't want that. So I'm just going to bring back this to its original value, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of like a gamma correction, something like that. Maybe a correction like that looks better. Let's re-render. And now it's just happening in some parts. It's not as strong as other parts, but it's definitely working. Let me rename all my files. This is my body code diffuse file. I can just copy this and paste this here, and I know this is my mask. If we open here, we can see what our mask looks like. So it's just like a grunge and noise mask. I just want to add it in some parts. So now that this is all working, I might want to tweak a little bit some of my settings just to add a tiny bit of more realism. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my SSS. Let's look at this part where we were getting some nice refractive effects. We had a specular, so I want to pay attention to this part. Maybe I can give this a tiny bit of color. Something like that. Re-render, see how that looks. Okay, we have a very subtle difference. Maybe I can make this a tiny bit lighter just by bringing this to, I don't know, let's say 7, just adding some value to it. So all these little tweaks are giving it very subtle changes, but are starting to change the way this looks, and I'm really starting to like this. I'm gonna maybe raise this value a tiny bit, I don't know, 1.25, raise the value of this a little bit. Let me bring this up so you guys see what I'm doing. 75 and give it a little bit more of saturation, 45. Render. Okay, if we change, I know it's very hard to see, but here, if you zoom in, you can see the difference. See how it looks like it's a little bit more reddish in the inside? Here was very gray. Now it's starting to look a little bit more reddish in the inside. That's the kind of effect that I'm looking for. So maybe I'm just going to raise this once more and raise this a tiny bit more. 0.8 and 0.5. That seems good enough. Let me select this area again. Render once more. So this is exactly what I was looking for. I know it's a very subtle change, but again, if we select out, you can see the difference. This was before I started changing these values. This is now. It gives it way more realism. Now we have the bump. We have our very different speculars, and we've added some roughness on top of it. One thing that I'm going to do really quick before we do anything is that I'm going to take this texture, my body code, and I'm just going to make it a tiny bit darker. So I'm going to maybe remap connected. So I want my out color to my color, break this connection, connect this, my out color to my color, and here I'm just going to touch a tiny bit the value. So close hue, close saturation, and I'm just going to draw this a little bit and maybe lower this, so just so it's a tiny bit darker. Let's give it one last render. Okay, I really like the way this is working. I'm going to leave it here so far for the body. I'm going to stop here, and on the next video we're going to start working on the trail that the snail leaves, and then we'll work on the metal, and then we can just add displacement and render our final image. So we'll continue on the next video.